Okay, let's get started. Today, what we're going to talk about is the schism, the religious split in the church that happens in the middle of the 17th century. And this religious split leads to a sect of orthodoxy that becomes known as the Old Belief or the Old Believers. And even to this day, there are communities of old believers in Alaska that live in relative isolation, conduct their own rites, and you can identify them by their dress. The women always are in long skirts and have a bonnet on. So when I, am down near Soldotna or in the airport, I can, I'll see, oh, there's someone of the old belief. Now, one thing I want to preface this with is in this lecture, you're going to hear me repeat an awful lot of the things that I've already mentioned, that I've talked about before. And why am I repeating when there's so much to cover and we really don't have enough time? But I am repeating because I think that we're talking about cultural and religious trends and political interests that intertwine in complicated ways. And since I know for me as a student, I didn't get all of the dynamics that were going on the first time I learned about it. And so I'm going to trust that some of you too, it can benefit to have these things repeated to you and hear them anew. And by the way, I don't understand all the dynamics that we're going to be talking about here yet. But with that said, we'll jump in the spirit of lifelong learning. So the last time we talked about the reign of Alexei Mihailovich, and I put before you that, or if I didn't in a nutshell, let me put before you in a nutshell that in the 17th century, with the Romanov dynasty, we are talking about a dynasty that is establishing itself. We studied the chaos of the time of troubles, and so we can really appreciate that major challenge of just having a dynasty that people look to as legitimate, having a state that has some power to do something. Oh, and let me I see that the screen share is saved. It paused. I think that now you're resuming sharing the screen. Well, all right. Well, I'll get to that when we need to make sure we're sharing pictures. So this dynasty is setting up. It needs to establish itself as legitimate. It is trying to be a state that can have some real power. And in that sense, one of the most important things that it's trying to do is to be able to collect revenue. And the 17th century is a century in which the pressures to collect revenue in order to field an army are greater than they had been in the past, because the ways in which armies are fielded are becoming so different, moving from smaller, primarily cavalry-based armies to bigger infantry armies with soldiers that carry guns and need boots and coats. This is expensive. And so the state needs to work harder to be able to collect revenue. And how do states collect revenue? They used to collect it from irregular levies, but taxation. And the Russian state gets its, the Russian state is actually a little bit unusual, or relative to the state of England, for example, in the medieval and early modern period. Russia gets more of its revenue from taxing things at markets and at the trading posts than it does from taxing individual people in their homes. And as a matter of fact, Russia doesn't even tax individual people in their homes in the way, say, that the IRS does, until the reign of Peter I. It institutes its first poll tax, or tax on individual males, in 1718. Prior to that, in the 17th century that we're talking about now, the state levies taxes on peasant communities. And if you'll recall, as I said last time, the nobles don't pay regular taxes in the way that townspeople, merchants, artisans do. And then peasants have to, they pay more in labor obligations, and they kind of, their lord collects it for them and hands it over to the state. But it's the lower classes that are taxed in 17th century Russia. And for much of the 17th century, even in a collective, at a collective group, the kind of townspeople of one town pony up a certain amount. It does get broken down, or the elders in a particular peasant village interface with the Lord to hand over their obligations. Of course, few people escape obligations in this state, but who interfaces with whom is kind of the point in which I'm talking about. And so in the 17th century, the state is really trying to set itself up. Are we legitimate? Can we collect revenue so that we can field armies and do things? And also can we police the state? That we're gonna only tangentially, the themes we're talking about do come into that today. The reign of Alexei Mikhailovich is a long reign, and it is largely seen as a successful reign in which the state manages to consolidate its own authority and exert that authority. The number of bureaucracies grow, the number of people working in those bureaucracies grow as well. As we saw last time, it's not without challenges. The salt riots of 1648, the copper riots of 1662, there are major challenges to this state. In really general terms, we could say there's a lot of social churn going on. Well, and so today we are looking at much of that cultural change and to think about how it generates some social churn. All right, now, first, I want to start out in terms of cultural change. Let me say a few words about Westernization. That there is, and I don't even, let's see, what well, I will try and share again, even though our sharing was not successful last time. Let me try and share again. Are you seeing the screen there? The pictures that I put up? Do you see Alexei Mikhailovich? Okay, good. All right. Those are, so here's, we talked last time, Salt Riot, upset. We talked about the copper riots in 1662. And I told you about how this new law code called the Ulizhenia is one of the, in the wake of the 1648 horrible riots. The Tsar said, okay, let's come together. And one of the things we need to do is have a clear law code. And here, actually, in this brass, here's a little bit of material history, in this brass container where it was made into big, big scrolls and rolled up. That is the law code of 1649 and a vessel that it was stored in. So now we have a law code, but all is not solved. As we talked about, the copper riots happened in 1662. I told you a little bit about this Cossack Stenka Razin, who led a rebellion down in the south of Russia and caused all sorts of problems until the state managed to capture him, and he was executed in 1671. So many challenges afoot. Maybe we'll just look at this picture for a while as I delve in and talk about some of the major cultural changes that are going on in the 17th century. Muscovy is seeing more exposure to the West. Russians are increasingly traveling to the West. There has been a bit of a trickle of diplomatic connections since, at least the 1470s, when Ivan III recruits his bride from Europe. But in large part, but as trade picks up, global exploration is picking up, there's more connection. And so Muscovy in the 17th century is sending ambassadors to England, to Spain, to the Holy Roman Empire, to the Papal Court, to Venice, to Persia, to the Ottoman court in Constantinople as well. They've had contacts there from the days of Vladimir in the 10th century. So we're seeing more connections. Similarly, it's not just Russians going places and coming back. More foreigners are coming to Russia, both for to form alliances against those troublesome Turks that are invading the southern Europe, but also for trade relations, is bringing thousands, probably under 10,000, but more than somewhere between, well, probably somewhere over 3,000 foreigners in the middle of the 17th century are living in Russia, and they're there for trade, they're there for diplomatic reasons, they're also there as recruited for military reasons. Russia, as it starts to modernize 17th century style, but as it starts to modernize its army with new weapons, new artillery, new formations, it is recruiting from Western places, from France, from England, from Scotland. It's recruiting military officers to help run its military affairs. And that accounts for several foreigners being in Russia, and also several accounts that have come down to us. Foreigners are also at court as physicians, apothecaries for the Tsar. One doctor from Scotland named Samuel Collins serves Alexei Mikhailovich for 9 years and writes, and there's a book now of that the state of Russia, which begins as kind of letters back to letters to correspondents back home in Scotland, in which he details quite a bit about life in Russia. And again, it's that sort of our reading this semester. Herberstein is there as a diplomatic envoy. Herberstein's there as a diplomatic envoy, and Jenkinson to develop commercial trade. Isaac Massa, a Dutchman, there for commercial trade. And then Olearius is, again, kind of diplomacy is his first purpose. But remember, in the early modern world, trade and diplomacy are very much fellow travelers. So even the base of our reading in this course is largely indicative, is a consequence of that increased foreign exchange. And so inevitably, these ideas get exchanged, especially once people like Isaac Massa did and Jenkinson did start really learning the language. Now, and even this is happening before the reign of Alexei Mikhailovich as well. If you'll recall, Boris Godunov tried hard to make a foreign match for his children. He tried with Denmark, he tried with Sweden, he actually tried with Persia too. None of it came to pass, and perhaps that has something to do with how the Romanovs, until Peter came along, very much settle on marrying a Russian bride from a lower noble family. But these attempts, nonetheless, brought Muscovites into contact with foreigners, because even for the weddings that didn't work out, for example, Gustav and Johann, who died, they came with entourages of hundreds of people from Scandinavia, and that initiated much exchange. Alexei Mikhailovich's second wife, Natalia Naryshkina, I showed you a picture of her last time. She was the daughter of one descendant of a Tatar noble, but she seems to have spent some time in the house of a man, Artemon Matviev, who had married a Scottish woman. Now, this is a bit contested, and Paul Boshkovich says the evidence really isn't here to know how much time Natalia Naryshkina stayed in the house of a Scottish, what the influence of this Scottish woman was, but it seems that there was, some exposure to traditions, very much traditions that weren't neither Russian nor Orthodox. And I could go on with many, many examples. One indication of cultural change is that Alexei Mikhailovich has a theater built in the Kremlin in the middle of the 17th century. We start to see more education happening in Russia as well. This is very important. Alexei Mikhailovich's sons, they learned some Polish, they learned Latin with Western tutors. Even in Olearis's account, you may have noted how he talks about a merchant who tried to recruit him to tutor his sons in Latin, which indicates that it's not even immediately at the court, but other urban people in Moscow see it as a benefit and advantageous to learn a foreign language. So contrary to some tropes about Russians being so closed off, that to me suggests a bit of openness. Teach me this language, teach my child this language. So, because I think it will help them. One foreigner that visited the Russian court and spent there for a while also reported that Russian merchants would try and recruit people to teach languages to their children, primarily Latin. We start to see Western dress coming into Russia. And this is sort of important too, because one conventional wisdom that people have said for a long time about Russia, but that I want you to recognize as being not the best way to characterize things, is that Russia was completely closed and xenophobic until Peter came along, and Peter turned Russians to the West and even brought light into Russia. This is a theme that runs strong in the historiography. And among these things, that Peter started to force nobles to shave their beards and wear Russian dress, and women to appear at court in European dresses. That's all true, but Western dress was starting to trickle into Russia earlier. And a 17th century noble, Vasily Golitsyn, even before Peter takes the throne, we know from inventories that he already had quite a bit of Western clothes. I'm going to talk to you about Avakum, who meets a very sad end. But Avakum, when he was in Siberia, there is, he relays this one moment in his account. He wrote maybe what's one of the first autobiographies in Russian history. But while he's in Siberia, he comes across on a road traveling one day the son of Prince Sheremetyev. To this day, the main airport in Moscow, the Sheremetyevo airport, is named after this noble family. And so in the 17th century, out in Siberia, a son of Prince Sheremetyev, the boyar, is traveling, and he meets Avakum, and he asks Avakum for his blessing. He recognizes him as a devout man of the cloth. He asks for his blessing, and Avakum scolds him, and he says something like, "You expect me to dress you when you're dressed like an infidel from the West, and you don't have a beard?" And so Avakum is not pleased at all with this request, and he lets this young prince looking for his blessing know it. That right there, though, is a glimpse of this Westernization that a long time that some people would only attribute to beginning in the reign of Tsar Peter I. Another way in which thing that's driving cultural change is that there's more and more print culture in Russia. If you'll recall, the first printing press comes to Muscovy in the reign of Ivan IV in 1563. Now there's this story, however, that it doesn't last too long, because some people end up chasing out of town the printers, and another printer will come back. It's controlled by the state, however, and so much of what comes off of the printing presses that are in Russia are military, some military manuals and church documents, mostly church documents. Russia very much, even as Russia is very behind the curve in terms of print culture. There, I said it, if you haven't noticed already, one of the real themes, one of the approaches I take to studying Russian history, and that I've tried to communicate to you, is that the traditional historiography, much of it written in the Cold War, has maybe been a bit unfair about judging Russia as so primitive and backward and xenophobic in all sorts of ways that I'm trying to push back against, because I think the historical records suggest to us that we really should reassess a lot of those conventional understandings. That said, Russia is far behind the curve when it comes to print culture, and so that's something to kind of think a lot about as we, as historians, kind of try to think about Russia's place in the world in the early modern period. At any rate, the first full translation of the Bible into Old Church Slavonic was the Gennady Bible. This was a project led by the Archbishop Gennady, go figure, from Novgorod, and it was only completed in 1499. This is just, almost 2 decades before Martin Luther initiates the Reformation. 1499, that's tremendously late, considering that conversion started in 988. And you might even think back to one of our beginning lectures about how, what were the consequences of going with the Orthodox Church, the Greek rites, in which there is more of in which the approach to conversion was to learn the local language and convey the faith in that local language, versus an approach to not translate the word of God and just make sure everyone knows that the people that need to read know Latin. Then you have ready-made books, at any rate. So first full translation of the Bible into Old Church Slavonic, 1499. I have to always check the date again because it seems so tremendously late. And get this, the first translation of the Bible into the Russian language, a more contemporary Russian language, including the books of the Apocrypha, only happens in 1876. It's remarkable. That said, so Russia's behind the curve if the Bible, the printing of the Bible is any indication, but there is a print culture there. If you'll recall, even in those 1662 copper riots, some pamphlets, some pamphlets, and even somewhat subversive pamphlets, historians have found, are circulating throughout Moscow. So there's little bits of print culture. In the 17th century, we start to have more secular literature, stories of kind of rogues and thieves and picaresque tales of people pulling one over each other's eyes, etc. We start to see in the 17th century more and more translations, and many of these translations are coming through Ukraine. We'll say more about that. And there is more of a book trade. People are buying books. Some of the merchants I studied for my first book, they have collections of books, and they're usually religious books of some sort, but devotional books that they own and keep in their own house. Another cultural change that is beginning is that people are starting, what we see in the 17th century, some of the first examples of portraiture, Russian portraiture. And here are a couple of those. There's some pictures of that early picture. Now, there's written evidence. So some documents tell us that Mikhail Fyodorov, the first Russian Tsar, 1613 to 1645 reign, that there's some evidence that images of him were being produced in Kremlin workshops in the 1620s. A parsuna, kind of an image of him on a horse. This is actually, this picture right here is, this is Mikhail Fyodorovich, but of a copy. But it said that a likeness of Mikhail Fyodorovich was sent to the Patriarch in Constantinople in 1632. And that is the first kind of known image of a known instance of a czar getting his picture done in some way, even though a parsuna isn't exactly a portrait. By contrast, Charles I of England, who rules in England in the first half of the 17th century, he has many portraits of himself painted at all stages in his life. Back in Henry VIII, who was the contemporary of Ivan IV, had many portraits of himself done, as did Charles V of Spain. So, so Russia is a little bit later coming to this practice of portraiture. Portraiture had begun as a practice really taking off in Europe among elites, of course, in the Renaissance. The first documented, but it no longer survives, not extant portrait of a Russian princess was Boris Godunov's daughter, Ksenia, and he had a miniature painted of her trying to, as part of his project, to secure a foreign groom. In contrast, in England in the 17th century, you're even starting to have a kind of subversive pinups of nude women circulating in 17th century English culture. I am not aware of anything like that in Russian culture. The first, so a merchant from Vologda gets his portrait painted, or this in 1684. I don't have that, an image of that right here. What I have here on this slide that you're looking at are two Russian men that went abroad as diplomats serving the Tsar, Chemodanov to Venice and Prozorovsky to England, who spent time abroad and had their portraits done in the middle of the 16th, in the middle of the 17th century. So even before Alexei Mikhailovich sits for a portrait, a merchant named Gavril Fitiev around the 16th, well, he died in 1684. He sat for a portrait during his lifetime. And Tsar Fyodor, who is the son of Alexei Mikhailovich and rules after him until his own death in 1682, he did much to advance portraiture. He commissioned posthumous images of his father, Alexei, and his grandfather, Mikhail Fyodorovich, to be placed on the graves of their kind of sarcophagi? Now, and then in the 1670s, we see this book gets produced that's called the Titularnik Herald Book. And it is, it's a reference book, and it has images of the czars throughout time. So this is there's an indication that now, oh, we think that we should have images of these leaders kind of in a book that people can refer to. It was kept in the armory of Russia. So those are some of the ways in which we're starting to see real cultural changes happen in Russia. And as I mentioned before, xenophobia competes for pride of place along with backwardness in terms of Muscovite stereotypes. But and to be sure, in the 17th century, Russia is starting to appropriate practices that have been being practiced in Western Europe longer, but I think that these practices are becoming practiced. Portraiture is happening. Western dress is being worn. Not all men have beards. These are all indications of a sort of an openness and a mixing that is occurring. Now, the biggest cultural the biggest kind of cultural change of all that we really want to talk about has to do with the church schism. And that's where I'm going to go now and kind of talk about for the rest of the lecture. So one of the one precondition of this cultural change, I think, has to do with the mix of ideas and the ways in which religion is practiced between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Russia. And much of this is coming through Ukraine, because Ukraine, over the course of the 17th century, I mean, one of the reasons is over the course of the 17th century, much of what's now Ukraine goes from being the jurisdiction of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to being the jurisdiction of Russia. And so it isn't hard to see how that necessarily is going to promote a certain level of exchange. And we've talked a little bit about them. And so now we kind of want to focus in on how that exchange of ideas is changing the way religion is practiced in Russia. Let's just review a couple of a few dates. So it's in 988 that the Orthodox Church is created in Kiev with Vladimir's baptism. We've started the course studying that. And then Kiev's like kind of settles at Kiev is the center of Orthodox religion in Slavic lands, but with the Mongol invasions and shifting trade routes, Kiev's light has faded, and the kind of biggest and busiest Russian towns are more to the north. And before Moscow really comes on the radar screen, it's Vladimir that's the bigger deal. And so the Metropolitanate had moved up to Vladimir in 1316, and then in the 1320s, though, the Metropolitan starts hanging out more in Moscow. It's not official immediately, but then this is kind of a clue that Moscow is the more happening place. It's officially becomes the seat of the Metropolitan in 1354. Kiev no longer is. Then in 1448, Moscow names its own Metropolitan without permission from Constantinople. This is a break in tradition, and it's a sign that Moscow really sees its own stock on the rise. It doesn't need to look to, it doesn't need to get permission in Constantinople. We remember how our Grand Prince Vladimir II, when he named his son without feeling like he needed permission from the Khan, we take that as a sign that Moscow is really coming into its own. And then 1453, this major world historical event that Constantinople, the most Christian Orthodox eastern city of the Eastern Roman Empire, falls to the Muslim Turks. And this sends disconcerting ripples throughout Christendom, disconcerting ripples throughout the Orthodox world and Moscow. And some people, church clerics, spend some time thinking, what does this mean? And we know that Ivan III takes his bride, Sophia Paleogia, in the late 15th century. 1482, Moscow sends an army to sack Kiev. And we haven't talked a lot about that, but just to put this in on your radar screen, that relationships between Moscow and Kiev aren't always kosher. And that part of, that's mostly Ukraine now, it's part of Lithuania. It kind of is claimed by lords of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, that in 1569, with that Union of Lublin, is going to join with Poland to make this really big state, perhaps better situated to resist that rising Muscovy, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. By the way, another moment I'll put in is in 1492, according to Orthodox calendars, that was going to be the end of the world. This is the early modern Y2K, the early modern Orthodox Y2K. No need to take calendars because it's curtains for life as we know it. That didn't happen. And so then you had church people that really had to scramble. What day are the saints' days? When is Easter going to be? How long is Lent? When is Lent going to start and end in these coming years? Just kind of an indication of some of the church beliefs that circulated at this time. All right, at any rate, so, and we've talked about this is a repeat. 1569, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth gets formed. 1589, Moscow raises its status from being a metropolitanate that kind of looks to Constantinople as its higher authority to being a patriarchate in its own right. This again is a sign Moscow really sees itself as a more important church leader. As we recalled, and it should be in this slide as well, is that in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, that was taken as a really concerning sign. And there was a recognition that, gee, to the east and south, so many of our subjects are Orthodox. And the Polish king isn't Orthodox. In fact, in the 1570s for a while, they have a Catholic, or they have even a French king on the throne. We talked about the development of the kind of Polish throne and tradition of king with who had checks and balances on him. At any rate, so Poland is like, well, what should we do? And one of the things that they decide to do is form this union of Brest, in which they say, for our subjects, we will now be members of a uniate church. You just keep doing orthodoxy like you always have, except now we look to the Pope. It wasn't quite that simple. It was, in fact, a very complicated endeavor. And as I said to you, this endeavor is backfires like no other. I mean, to me, it's really one of the biggest backfires in history. I personally see it as a quite cynical move, inspired more by geopolitical concerns. That is, we don't want our subjects looking to Moscow for its answers, than one inspired by spiritual concerns. And at any rate, it doesn't really take. And this has many ripple effects. But at any rate, so now in the 1596, this uniate church gets formed. And in 1622, for example, Tsar Mikhail Fyodorovich, he forbade the importation of Polish books into Russia. There were lots of Jesuits, Catholic Jesuits in Poland, and Jesuits were very much, one of their main missions was about educating. Again, if you'll remember, the Counter-Reformation that was the church's answer to the Reformation. And one of the ways in which the church said, we need to respond to this major splintering is we need to do a better job of teaching our priests, teaching our clerics what our faith is, and educating the flock. And so you have movements like the Society of Jesus that Jesus founded around the Reformation to teach, and they develop wonderful models. I mean, there's a number of fine Jesuit institutions right here in the United States of America. So they're really good at teaching, and they're founding universities in Poland. And so before we know it, even Orthodox people that are Orthodox in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth are quite influenced by Jesuit modes of teaching and Latin. For example, in 1632, the Peter Michila is established as the Metropolitan of Kiev. He's of Polish descent, and he establishes the Kiev Michila Academy. It's Orthodox, but it's very much draws on Jesuit approaches to learning, which leaves some conservative Orthodox people quite uncomfortable. But nonetheless, these models are starting to trickle in. In 1682, in Moscow, is established the Slavonic Latin Greek Academy. And there, right in the name, tells you something really important. Slavonic, Latin, Greek. It's teaching all of these languages to its student, and it's mostly, it's mostly to educate people that will be in the church. It is modeled on the Kiev Michila Academy that had been established in 1632. It's got a really strong Latin curriculum, and once you can read Latin, you can read not only the Bible, you can read Aristotle and other Greek and classical philosophers, pagans of the ancient world that hadn't been translated into Old Church Slavonic. So you can start to see how there's this, that the conduits for exchange are really opening up in this churn, and they trickle in. Even in what we find is in Moscow in the 1620s, 1630s, some of the high clerics are clerics that are coming from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth or Ukraine, the Kiev Michila Academy, and now they're taking up high positions in Moscow, kind of the seat of the patriarchate, and so they're influenced by that. Here is and then now this brings us, this is all kind of long background that gets us to our story. And with the founding of the Slavonic Latin Greek Academy in 1682, I kind of jumped ahead of the story that I'm about to tell you now, but it's just a really clear example of some of that Western influence that's worked its way into Moscow. And even in this chronology, the founding of this sort of academy is, the discussion of doing it is in the works for a couple decades before it actually gets founded in 1682, which kind of fits, I think, fits well into these trends. So here we are. Let's come back to Moscow and just think about, Moscow, seat of these churches, and have a picture of inside a church that we've seen before as we come to this story of the schism in Muscovy. And so the way I'm telling you this story is I've just spent a whole bunch of minutes talking about Ukrainian influence and kind of influence from the West into how church education is happening. And then I want to kind of draw an arrow from that to the church reforms that are going to happen in the middle of the century, and draw an arrow from that to the church crisis. That's how I see it, to kind of simplify somewhat. So here's this story, and who are our characters in it? So this story happens, the schism happens in the reign of Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, and it happens with this man, Nikon. Nikon becomes, bear with me for just one moment here. So Nikon is born in 1605. He runs away from home. He's a self-taught, a charismatic individual, becomes a priest, goes to Moscow, and he makes an impression on the young Alexis. He is, in 1642, he rises, 1652. He rises and he is made patriarch of the Orthodox Church in Moscow. At first, as is Russian custom, he demurred and said, "Oh no, I shouldn't. It's not me. I'm not worthy." But then when asked again, he accepts upon the solemn oath of obedience that Nikon, a solemn oath of obedience, that is, that he would be obeyed in his role as patriarch. He was a bold individual. And one of the first things that he wanted to do, he comes into office and he consulted with Greek clerics abroad. He invited them to Moscow to compare, and he consulted with scholars abroad from the Orthodox world. And he decided that the way Muscovites were practicing orthodoxy was a bit out of date. I need to actually tell you one more thing. Before he gets this huge promotion in 1652, he's in Moscow for some years, and he was a member of this study group, you might call it, the Zealots of Piety. And this was a reform movement of clerics and very religious people in Moscow that wanted to think about, are we practicing our faith in the best way possible? And they called themselves the Zealots of Piety. They were interested in reforms. The goal was to bring religion closer to the people. And I think that, so to back up, kind of big back up, was there a Reformation in Russia? No, the Reformation didn't get to Russia. Yet, I do think it's fair, or yet we might see this and these kind of trends as ripple effects of Reformation. Although simultaneously, I see them very much as ripple effects of some geopolitical competition between states of different religion and that competing for kind of subjects on the same territory. So it's a little bit messy, but otherwise I did want to just step back a little bit and think about, is there a Reformation in the Orthodox world? I don't think this isn't the Reformation, but there are ripple effects. Okay, so in the Zealots of Piety, I've mentioned his name before, and we're going to hear him again. Avakum is also a group, is also a member of this group. Avakum is going to be absolutely off the rails, not supportive of the things that Nikon is going to promote. But I think it's worth knowing that they're part of this study group together, the Zealots of Piety, in the 1630s. So back to 1652, Nikon is made patriarch, and pretty quickly he decides that the liturgical books the books that priests have been using to say the Mass are a little bit wrong. And we need to just have an overhaul, revamp, reform them. And so he introduces new liturgical books. Here is a 19th century portrait of Nikon presiding over a council where they're discussing that reform of books. He is, so pretty quickly, people in the church, like Avvakum, decide we don't like this reform. And it sounds like what social historians can tell us, and unfortunately your humble peasant and townsperson artisan wrote so little for us in the historical record that it's harder to get a sense of what they thought. But it seems like people that went to church were also like, whoa, what you talk about, Willis? Like, I hate change. And that the church books reforms didn't go over so well there either. Also, kind of perhaps as an irony of history, some historians have looked back and said, actually, it looks like Nikon understood himself to be spearheading a movement that would get the Russian Orthodox service back to a kind of more true, more authentic, closer to the original service. But it turns out that so many of the Greek books were built on recensions or revisions of later books, such that now some historians have determined that the Mass as it was being practiced in Russia in 1650, for example, was closer to the Mass as it was practiced centuries earlier than, say, a Mass in Constantinople in 1650, because of kind of the following the trajectories of how the liturgy had been revised. At any rate, so Nikon proposes these reforms. Turns out there's resistance, more resistance than anyone planned. It's a real crisis in the church. And ultimately, the reforms are going to go through. The synod, the church governing bodies, they hold to those reformed books. And that is what prevails in mainstream Orthodoxy. But I need to tell you that this tension surrounding Nikon is not only a tension about church. It is also a tension about who's the greater authority. And I've mentioned this to you before. So Nikon is saying to Alexei, I'm running the church, I'm running this project, but Nikon also was looking to Alexei to be subordinate to him. And we can't entirely blame him, right? Because after all, Patriarch Philaret was very much the dominant figure in the match between Patriarch and Tsar when it was father and son, and a more kind of a father with a more dominant personality than his son in any case. So Nikon had that precedent to look to and said, I expect you to kind of defer to me in terms of orders, etc. And Alexei is thinking, no, we're not going to do that. And so but I mean, at the same time, he, is a very devout czar. So he doesn't want to smite God, for example. But anyway, Nikon and Alexei end up having this falling out over this very thing. And Nikon, in 1658, the falling out happens with Alexei makes a stance over this challenge to his supremacy. Basically, the Patriarch Nikon makes some remarks saying, and the Tsar too is subordinate to me because I'm God's first servant on earth. And Alexei says no. And the Patriarch says, oh, really? Well, then I am abandoning the patriarchy. And he sort of exiles himself. And Alexei doesn't want to go so far to say, I'm kicking you out. And so we have this 2-year period where there's no patriarch in Moscow. 1660, the council, the synod comes together and they're going to replace the patriarch. But then even this church council balks at doing that. They're like, well, Nikon is still the proper patriot. And so they don't make the move. And then, because the Tsar Alexei, we understand, he's afraid of committing a mortal sin. He's not remotely flippant about ousting the patriarch. And so And so in 1660, Nikon isn't ousted, and that, or he's not replaced. And so, and no patriarch is actually going to be replaced for 6 more years, not until 1666. And, or in 1666, the synod comes together and they take they've seen that there's been a good amount of resistance to the new books. They uphold the reforms that Nikon implemented. They say, we are going to hold to these reformed liturgical books, doing the mass a little bit different and a few other things different. But they depose Nikon for good that time. And so now he's out. He'll spend the rest of his life out of exile and just comes back to Moscow briefly before his death in 1681. And so that sort of, the question is settled. The Tsar is more powerful than the patriarch in a political sense, for sure. And the new liturgical reforms are what is mainstream orthodoxy. But going forward, it's not over yet, because many people, as I've said, resist. And those figures that resist are some high level figures. One of the highest level figures is the Boyarina Morozova. Boris Morozov is, remember, he was the bad guy in the 1648 salt riots, and people really saw him as that greedy boyar around the Tsar, giving him bad counsel and the reason for their misery. He's from a really wealthy boyar family, and a matriarch in his family, she refused to do the new rite. And she ended up suffering for it and being taken away. The kind of Tsar Alexei, he didn't want to rock the boat too much, and he sort of said, can we just do a sort of don't ask, don't tell thing? But she wasn't going to play that way at all. She refused to go to a wedding. She refused to kind of just even show up and be silent. And so she kind of took a sufficiently defiant stand that she was arrested for her refusal to go along with the old rite. Remember, we are still in a time prior to that notion of separation between church and state. It's a theocracy. So Boyarina Morozova is a high profile adherent to what become the schism, as was, I mentioned to you, Avvakum, popular priest who is a member of the Zealots of Piety. He and Nikon know each other well, but he too refuses to go along with the new liturgical books. He's exiled to Siberia, and it's out there that he gets to scold that Prince Sheremetyev for wearing Western clothes and not having a beard. After Nikon dies, Avvakum gets to come back, not to Moscow, but to Pustozersk in the Russian north, but he won't be quiet about it, and he ends up being executed in 1682. 2 years later, in 1684, there's a state decree saying refusal to adhere to the reforms is a crime punishable by death, and many people will choose that route. A practice of self-immolation happens in several isolated incidences. I am even in a church near Tyumen, the Siberian town in which I did my research, I came across documents saying, reporting on an incident where a number of people, schismatics, people who didn't want to go along with the new church, locked themselves into a church and burned it down. I find this, we are all living in the wake of 9/11, where the religious fanaticism of those, the people that drove planes into the towers and into the Pentagon and that crashed in a field in Pennsylvania, horrified so many Americans of a secular world, and the incidents of suicide bombers horrifies us. What could bring people to make these choices? And in an essay on this book, Portraits of Old Russia, it's kind of a composite article where I sort of reflect on that, or imagine, it's a composite portrait. It's the closest maybe I've ever written to historical fiction, but sort of thinking about what it meant to be in the presence of people who choose suicide for reasons of religious right, rights, R-I-T-E, that the rights are so important. At any rate, I can, if you're interested in that article, send me an email and I can share it with you. It's only a dozen pages or so I didn't assign it to you. This painting has him being burned at the stake. And to be perfectly honest, I'm not entirely sure that that's the case. This is a picture from the Litzavoy Svod. And according to the Uluzhenia, anyone that was trying to convert someone away from orthodoxy was subject to death by burning, but the burning was in a box, not at the stake. Burning, which is at the stake, and burning people at the stake was a Western tradition. I actually don't know how Avakum, if he was burned at the stake or in a box, which was the Russian tradition for someone that tried to convert someone away from orthodoxy. It wasn't the same punishment if you went out and met an Ostyak or a pagan and tried to convert them to Islam. That wasn't punishable in the same way. But if a Muslim cleric tried to convert someone who was Orthodox to Islam, that was punishable in the eyes of the state, because the state understood itself to be an institution to protect God's flock and promote God's salvation in the way that they understood it. So those are kind of, so Boyarina Morozova, Avakum, these are some high profile people we know about who died in their refusal to go along with the church reforms that Nikon spearheaded in the middle of the 17th century. But it wasn't just them. As I said, there were many cases of self-immolation where individuals would go into it, would commit group suicide by burning themselves in their church. And there were also communities that isolated themselves. Robert Crummy has a wonderful book about merchants of Vig, a merchant community in northern Russia that sort of lived in really lockdown isolation for decades and decades. And with changing rulership, old believers were more or less persecuted. And if you'll notice, I just used that word old belief just for the first time right now. And the reason is, in doing that, I'm drawing on Georg Michel's interpretation, where he says, first we have a schism. And an old belief as such, he thinks that it kind of coalesces into a new religion several decades later. So, and he thinks that one of the reasons it coalesces is in the wake of continued persecution. And Sophia Alexeyevna, who will be a regent of Russia after Tsar Fyodor Alexeyevich dies in 1689, she really stepped up persecution. Peter continued it as well. This is sort of just a timeline recapping events in this story that I've just told you. But the old belief, it continues as a movement. And the way that Georg Michels in his book At War with the Church talks about it is that he sees it, because there's this question to answer, how do we understand what this movement is all about? Is it really about the theology, or is it just cosmetic? And by that, I mean, if you've heard anything about the old belief, one of the things that you hear about is, will the sign of the cross be made with 3 fingers or with 2 fingers? And that is that the old belief wanted to maintain the 2 finger, and the 2 finger cross. This is symbolizing the dual nature of Christ, that Christ is both God and man. And there's this, and it turns out that the 2 finger way of doing it was probably the more ancient practice. There's a 6th century, so an icon made in the 500s that has the sign of the cross being read like this. And the Orthodox, if the Latin Church makes crosses themselves across the heart first and then comes back, in the Orthodoxy, it goes first to here and then across in making the sign of the cross. But the reform of Avakum Here, the idea was the three fingers represent the Trinity, God, Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And so this is one of the issues. This is one of the reforms that Nikon was instituting, that now the sign of the cross will be made holding up three fingers instead of two. And schismatics didn't want to go along with that. Here is, if you can see, Boyarina Morozova, she's being taken away to prison, holding up two fingers. And the idea was the Trinity is down here. The Trinity is down here, and the dual nature of God is up here in the two fingers. Some people can look at this debate and see it as being, and asking with wonder, really, was it that consequential? I think it just gives us pause at the challenge of getting inside the mindset of other people. But some historians say, no, it really isn't all about, it's not about this cosmetic matter of fingers. If that's a part of it, that's not the most important thing that's going on. And by the way, actually, I want to interject here. This icon doesn't entirely, I'm not sure that this really reflects that, but I went to this fascinating art historical presentation once where the presenter talked about how art historians had found icons in which they could see they'd been scrubbed, like a pre-Photoshop version where people had kind of gone in to either erase a third finger or insert a finger into existing icons to try and create a visual deep fake for whatever side that they were on. And I think that was both a fascinating bit of historical research and remarkable as we kind of live in this world of visual deep fakes now. At any rate, how do we understand the schism? And I've been talking a long time. Is it about theology? Is it something cosmetic? How much is it wrapped up with this high church politics of who's supreme, whose authority is ultimate? Is it the czar? Is it the patriarch? Is it the synod? Or is this idea, or is there something wider and more comprehensive about it? And here I'll give not super tangible facts, but I'm drawing on Georg Michael's work here that talks about it being seeing the emergence of the old belief as part of a social protest movement and reflective of wider unrest, and pointing out that this is a society in which serfdom has just been recently juridically legalized. Yes, we saw that in the 1590s with the suspension of the Forbidden Years, it's starting to happen, but it is the Ulagenia, this law code in 1649, that really puts it down in ink, that a serf is a thing and the state can mobilize resources to capture you and bring you back to the lord to whom you owe obligations indefinitely. So that creates a lot of unhappy ripples in society. And then this militarization and the pressures of taxation and a state that's more encroaching and calling for these changes in traditions that many people didn't perhaps understand, all seem to have contributed to it. Plus, I'm kind of one, I think, persuasive theory is that the church persecution of old belief served to not eliminate it, but rather consolidate that a kind of group identity that if in the 1650s, you're really better off saying just schismatics. But by the 1700s, we can say, yes, there's an old belief. There are people of the old belief, and they call that their own religion. All right, and with that, we'll stop.